You put $50,000 on the table. Two paths are in front of you. One comes with a set of keys, a tenant, and a story you can tell at every dinner party for the next decade. The other comes with a confirmation email and a lot of silence. Jake takes the keys. Marcus takes the silence. They both think they made the smarter choice. And they're both right, and they're both wrong, in ways neither of them fully understands yet. Because when you actually run the full numbers over 20 years, not the napkin math, not the YouTube thumbnail math, but the real math, the gap between these two paths will either confirm everything you believed or flip it completely upside down. My name is Dave, and I spend way too much time thinking about how people build wealth, where they lose it, and why the most confident investors in the room are often working off the most incomplete information. If you're someone who wants to make a serious investment decision with serious money, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it helps you see the full picture before you commit. Let's set the stage. Jake and Dave, wait, let me put it this way. Jake and Marcus both have $50,000 saved. They both earn $55,000 a year. Same age, same city, same financial starting point. The only variable is what they each do with that 50 grand. Jake uses it as a 20% down payment on a $250,000 rental property, a modest 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood. He takes out a 30-year mortgage at 7% interest. His monthly mortgage payment comes out to about $1,330. He finds a tenant willing to pay $1,800 a month in rent. On paper, that's $470 a month in profit before he spent a single dollar on anything else. Jake feels like a genius. Marcus takes the same $50,000 and drops it into a total stock market index fund. No leverage, no tenants, no keys to hand over. He sets up an automatic contribution of $300 a month and doesn't think about it again. His coworkers ask him what he's investing in. He says, index funds. They nod politely and change the subject. Nobody's impressed. On day one, Jake has a house, a tenant, and a story. Marcus has a brokerage account and a confirmation email. It's not even close in terms of how it feels. But here's the thing, feelings and math are two very different things. For the first few years, Jake is living the landlord dream. Rent checks hit his account on the first of every month. He drives past his property on the way to work and thinks, I own that. He's claiming mortgage interest and depreciation on his taxes. He's building equity with every mortgage payment. He's watching comparable homes in the neighborhood tick up in value. Everything about this investment feels real, tangible, and smart. Marcus logs into his brokerage account once a quarter, sees the number go up a little, then down a little, then up a little more. Year 1, his $50,000 grows to about $55,000. Year 2, maybe $61,000. It doesn't feel like anything is happening. There's no key in his pocket, no tenant texting him, no asset he can point to from his car window, just a number on a screen that moves in silence. Jake's friends ask him about the property. Marcus's friends don't ask him about anything. The social proof alone makes Jake feel like he's winning by a mile. And that feeling? It's a leaking bucket dressed up as a fountain. Here's the thing most people miss. Let's look at the actual numbers through year 3. Jake has collected roughly $64,800 in rent. His mortgage payments total about $47,880. That leaves $16,920 in gross cash flow. Sounds great until you subtract everything else. Property taxes run about $3,000 a year. Insurance adds another $1,500. He's already replaced a water heater for $1,200, fixed a leaking roof for $2,800, and dealt with 1 month of vacancy between tenants. That's $1,800 in lost rent plus $600 to clean and relist. Property management? Jake does it himself to save money. But that means phone calls at 10 in the evening, weekend showings, and coordinating repairs on his lunch break. After all real costs, Jake's actual net cash flow over 3 years is somewhere around $2,000 to $4,000, not the $16,920 that looked so good on a napkin. And none of that accounts for a single hour of his time. Marcus, meanwhile, has put in $50,000 upfront plus $10,800 in monthly contributions. At roughly 10% average annual return, his portfolio is sitting at about $76,000. 0 hours managing it, 0 phone calls, 0 emergencies. But, and this is important, Jake still has leverage working for him. His $250,000 property has appreciated maybe 3 to 4% a year and is now worth somewhere between $270,000 and $280,000. His equity, the difference between what the house is worth and what he owes, has grown to roughly $55,000 to $65,000. That's real wealth, and it came partly from using the bank's money. That's the power of leverage. And it's the one structural advantage that stock investors simply cannot replicate with a brokerage account. Now, I need to pause here, because this is where a lot of these comparisons go wrong, and some of you in the comments on videos like this one are absolutely right to call it out. In this scenario, Marcus is contributing an extra $300 a month out of pocket. Jake is not. That's not an apples-to-apples comparison. So let's fix it. What if Jake took his monthly cash flow, even the reduced real-world version, and invested it alongside his property? Even $150 a month in index funds on top of his rental equity changes his 20-year picture significantly. The most powerful real estate investors don't just sit on rent checks, they deploy them. Keep that in mind as we go deeper into the math. And the crazy part is, the rent check is the number everyone talks about. It's the number on the YouTube thumbnail, the number at the real estate meetup, the number your landlord buddy brags about at the barbecue. What nobody talks about is everything that comes out of that rent check before you actually keep any of it. Vacancy. The average rental property sits empty about 1 month per year. That's not a disaster, but it's a full mortgage payment with zero income to cover it. And when a tenant leaves, you're paying for cleaning, minor repairs, listing fees, and your own time to screen and show, maintenance and repairs. The general rule is to budget 1 to 2% of the property's value per year. On a $250,000 house, that's $2,500 to $5,000 annually. Some years it's a $200 faucet fix. Other years it's a $7,000 HVAC replacement in August that you didn't see coming and absolutely cannot postpone because your tenant is threatening to leave. Capital expenditures. Roofs last 20 to 25 years. Furnaces last 15 to 20. Water heaters last 10 to 12. These are guaranteed future costs that arrive in chunks of $5,000 to $15,000. If you're not setting aside money every single month for these, you're not running a business. You're running on luck. Property management. If Jake hires a professional manager, that's 8 to 10% of monthly rent gone immediately, roughly $150 to $180 a month. If he manages it himself, he's working a part-time job he's not being paid for. Either way, it costs something. Sound familiar? And then there's the risk nobody wants to discuss. Bad tenants. A tenant who stops paying and understands the eviction process can cost you 3 to 6 months of lost rent plus legal fees. That single event can erase an entire year's profit, or more. None of this shows up in the $470 a month cash flow figure. But it shows up eventually. It always does. By year 5, Jake is deep in the reality of being a landlord. He's on his third tenant, he's replaced the roof for $8,500. He's dealt with a plumbing emergency that cost $1,400. He spent 1 month with the property empty between tenants. He's raised rent to $1,950, which helps. But his property taxes and insurance have gone up too. His actual cash-on-cash return, the money he pockets relative to the money he put in, is hovering around 3 to 5% after all real expenses. Not bad, but not the 15 to 20% he was telling his friends about at the barbecue. Marcus is still doing absolutely nothing. His portfolio has grown from $50,000 to roughly $135,000 to $150,000 by year 7. That includes his $300 monthly contributions. He didn't pick stocks, he didn't time the market, he didn't do anything except not touch it. Here's where it gets really interesting. The compound growth is starting to accelerate. The gains on his gains are now generating more new wealth each year than his original contributions. Compounding is boring for the first 5 years. It's astonishing for the next 15. Think about it this way. The snowball that looked tiny at the top of the hill is starting to pick up serious mass. By year 10, Jake's property is worth roughly $335,000 to $350,000. His remaining mortgage balance is about $166,000. That puts his equity at approximately $170,000 to $184,000. Over 10 years after subtracting every real cost, mortgage interest, taxes, insurance, repairs, vacancy, capital expenditures, Jake's total out-of-pocket beyond the original down payment is somewhere between $20,000 and $35,000. Marcus's portfolio, with consistent $300 monthly contributions and roughly 10% average annual returns, is sitting at approximately $165,000 to $180,000. He put in $50,000 upfront plus $36,000 in contributions. $86,000 total. The rest is pure compound growth, and he spent exactly 0 weekends fixing anything. At year 10, they are surprisingly close in total wealth. Jake might be slightly ahead thanks to leverage, but here's the kicker. Jake also spent hundreds of hours managing his property, took on hundreds of thousands in debt, and concentrated his entire investment in a single asset in a single zip code. Marcus diversified across thousands of companies and never lost a night of sleep over a broken pipe. Alright, real talk. If you had $50,000 today, which path would you actually take? Drop it in the comments. Index funds or rental property? I want to see where this audience lands. This is where the story fully separates. By year 20, Jake's property is worth roughly $450,000 to $500,000. His mortgage is either paid off or nearly so. His equity sits somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 depending on appreciation. He's been collecting rent the entire time. But after 20 years of maintenance, repairs, turnover, taxes, insurance, and at least one major renovation, his total net profit from cash flow might be $40,000 to $80,000 above what he spent. Maybe more in a hot market, maybe less in a flat one. Marcus's portfolio at 10% average annual return, with $300 monthly contributions, has grown to approximately $420,000 to $460,000. That's with total contributions of $122,000 over 20 years. The other $300,000 plus is pure compounding. No debt, no tenants, no 2 in the morning phone calls about a broken pipe. When you compare net worth, they're in the same ballpark, somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 each. But how they got there is completely different. Jake worked for his. Marcus waited for his. Jake had stress, risk concentration, and illiquidity. Marcus had volatility, but liquidity and freedom. And now we arrive at the punchline. If Marcus had increased his monthly contribution by just $200, bringing it to $500 a month, his 20-year portfolio jumps to roughly $550,000 to $600,000. Because in the stock market, increasing your contribution has a multiplied effect through compounding. In real estate, scaling up usually means buying another property, taking on another mortgage, and doubling your workload. But here's where I have to be straight with you. If I only showed you the downsides of real estate, I'd be doing exactly what every stock market influencer does. Stocks have real risks that people love to gloss over. Volatility is brutal. In 2008, the market dropped roughly 37%. In March 2020, it dropped 34% in a single month. If Marcus had $150,000 in his portfolio and watched it fall to $95,000 in a few weeks, that's not a number on a screen. That's gut-wrenching. And the data is clear. Most retail investors panic sell during crashes and buy back in after the recovery. They lock in losses at the worst possible time. There's no cash flow. Unlike a rental property, index funds don't send you a monthly check. Dividends exist. But on a total market fund, you're looking at maybe 1.5% to 2% yield. On $150,000, that's about $200 a month. That's not replacing anyone's income. No leverage. Marcus used $50,000 to control $50,000 in assets. Jake used $50,000 to control $250,000 in assets. That 5-to-1 leverage is powerful when property values rise. And it's the main reason real estate creates more millionaires than the stock market in many surveys. And there's no depreciation deduction. Real estate investors can deduct the theoretical decline in a building's value from their taxable income, even if the property is actually appreciating. That's a legal tax shelter that stock investors simply don't have access to. Here's what most people don't realize. Real estate wins in specific, identifiable situations. If you're in a market where the rent-to-price ratio is strong, meaning monthly rent is at least 0.8 to 1% of the purchase price, the cash flow math works in your favor from day one. If you're willing to treat it as a business, not a side hustle, screening tenants carefully, budgeting for capital expenditures, building systems, the returns can exceed stocks, especially with leverage. If you use house hacking, living in one unit and renting the others, you can reduce your own housing costs to near zero while building equity. The stock market simply cannot do that. And if you understand 1031 exchanges which let you defer capital gains taxes by rolling profits into a new property, you can grow your real estate portfolio in ways stock investors can't replicate without retirement accounts. Now, one more scenario the comment section keeps asking about, and rightfully so. What happens when you do both? What if Jake took even a portion of his rental income and invested it into the market alongside his property? What if Marcus used his liquid portfolio to eventually fund a down payment on a rental? Actually, let me put it this way. The most powerful wealth builders aren't choosing between these two paths. They're sequencing them. Start with the market. Build liquidity. Build the habit of not touching it. Then, when you have enough equity and a genuine understanding of your local real estate market, use leverage strategically. Don't let a YouTube comment section or a podcast guest talk you into either side without running your own numbers. Real estate isn't a bad investment. It's a misunderstood one. Jake and Marcus both walked away from that $50,000 decision thinking they had made the smart play. Jake thought real estate was the proven path. Marcus thought the market would do the work. Neither of them actually sat down and mapped out what this costs. In dollars, in time, in stress, in risk, over 10 or 20 years. The real trap isn't real estate, and it isn't stocks. The real trap is picking either one based on a headline, a podcast clip, or something your uncle said at Thanksgiving, without ever running the full numbers for your own situation. And I get it. The math is overwhelming. But that's exactly why you're here. Because the answer that includes everything is the only answer that actually matters. If this changed how you think about the real estate versus stocks debate, pass it along to someone who's still making this decision based on half the information.